First of all, thinking about who was interned during the Second World War. So initially, during the First World War, there'd been a mass internment of enemy alien males. So an enemy alien is anybody who was born in a country that this country was then at war with. So you had all of the German males were interned en masse and then deported at the end of the First World War. Now, for the Second World War, it was quite apparent that there was actually a very big difference between the type of enemy aliens that there were living in the country at the outbreak of war. There was an awareness that a number of these were refugees. So the hope was that they could avoid mass internment. And indeed, for the first stages of the war, it was avoided. What they did was the British government instituted a policy of tribunals. So they brought every single enemy alien in the country before a tribunal, and they could had all their documents and could present their case, and they would be given a classification. And the three classifications were A, and so these were considered the most dangerous, who needed to be locked up immediately. B, where they weren't quite sure, so what they did was they said, we're not going to lock you up, but we are going to monitor you. You need to you need to be registered with, well, everyone had to be registered with the police station, but they weren't allowed to own certain pieces of equipment like bicycles or cameras, and they were more closely monitored than the C category, which was essentially considered genuine refugee. So C was what genuine refugees hoped to be classified as, and many were, but there was quite a wide variety in classifications. It depended whether these were all held locally, so it depended on whether your local magistrate didn't like foreigners or they didn't like communists or things like this. So you could find that even within neighbouring areas, the classifications would be given quite differently. Some people just labelled everyone as a B because they couldn't quite decide what they wanted to do with them. There was one instance of a judge who actually did a sort of B and then lots of subcategories, which then the Home Office couldn't quite handle that. So then they just made everybody, they deemed them all sort of more dangerous. So in theory, there was a setup to help people avoid being interned if you're a genuine refugee. But in practice, although this worked in many cases, you had examples of certain judges, if they felt that you didn't speak enough English, then you were more of a threat than if you spoke perfect English, which is a slightly backwards way of looking at it, as obviously if you wanted to be a spy, it would be more successful to be fluent in English. If you were a communist, you were viewed to be almost more dangerous than if you held sort of pro-fascist beliefs. So you can see that there was quite a disparity in this. So what happened was anyone who was categorised as A was immediately interned, but for the early parts of the war, if you were categorised as B or C, then you were still at liberty. So in theory, this was working in terms of avoiding mass internment. However, as Claire said, after the fall of France and the Low Countries, you start to hear a lot more build-up of xenophobia and fear of a fifth column, and the rumours were rife that the only way that France and the Low Countries could have fallen so quickly was by the help of actually Germans who'd already moved into the area and were acting as a fifth column and spies. And it was really as a result of this mass hysteria that then the call for mass internment came. So there is the famous collar the lot expression from Winston Churchill in June, and internment had already started happening before that. Now, for the majority of cases, we're looking at the male population, specifically if they are of sort of arms-bearing age, but it was meant to be between the ages of 16 and 60, and the elderly and the infirm were meant to not be interned. But due to the chaos surrounding how internment happened, it meant that you did actually get cases where people were arrested who weren't meant to be arrested. And with the Germans and Austrians, they had the tribunal system. And it's just important to note that for Italians, when actually Italy declared war against Britain in June, the tribunals had pretty much been wound down. So they just decided that all Italian men were enemies and should be arrested en masse. So it was a slightly different setup for them. Now, there were actually also some arrests of women and children as well. So if you were a woman who was classified C as a genuine refugee, then you were left alone. Generally speaking, the British government didn't think if you were a woman you were likely to be a spy, despite evidence to the contrary from the First World War. If you were an A, obviously you had already been interned, and if you were a B, then you would be interned in this sort of second wave of mass internment. In the case of children, if there was another relative who the child could be sent to, then they would try and arrange that. They tried to avoid putting the children into the camps initially, although that meant that quite a lot of children were put into care, which wasn't an ideal situation either. But ultimately, there was a family camp established for women and children, and so then they could be reunited on the Isle of Man, but sort of more on that later. So this picture just shows an example of what was happening when some of the women were being arrested. Arrests normally took place at either their home or place of work. It was often very early in the morning. There was sort of no warning, and a police detective would turn up on the doorstep and knock and ask for which members of the household were being interned. There was very little accurate information given at the time, so people didn't know whether this was a temporary thing. They didn't know how long they were going to be away for. They didn't know where they were going, so it was quite distressing. There's one story of a 6-year-old girl whose father came to be arrested, and she recalled that this is how it happened in her house, and I quote, "I was asked to come out and I kissed him goodbye, which was quite dreadful. I was crying and my mother was crying. My father was struggling not to cry, and then he was marched off. We didn't know where. The detectives didn't know. There were detectives from Harrow Road Police Station. What could they know? They wouldn't have known a real enemy alien at 50 paces. So my mother and I were left alone, and there followed weeks of absolute misery while my mother worried desperately about where my father was. We could get no news." And I think this was the most stressful time of internment because of just the lack of communication, the lack of information. At this stage, it wasn't entirely sure where everyone was going to go. In the First World War, the Isle of Man was used, and it seemed the obvious place to put the internees again. But the issue was it was going to take time to get everything set up on the Isle of Man. And in the meantime, they had thousands of enemy aliens to deal with. So what happened was, upon initial arrest, they were taken to their local police station, where they would stay anything from a number of days to a few weeks, and then they'd be moved on to transit camps. So transit camps could be anything from a field where they've hastily put barbed wire around and thrown up a few tents. It could be a racetrack like Kempton Park or Lingfield. For the women who were interned right at the beginning, they were sent to Holloway Prison, which was a very traumatic experience for them. Later on, they were sent to schools and hospitals and other communal places. In terms of the men, they had a very, very mixed bag in terms of accommodation. So the worst camp was one called Warth Mills, or Rath Mills, as one of the internees called it. Just a description from one of the internees, and I quote, "The rooms were dark, even in those sunny days of July, the floors soaked with the oil which for years had dripped from the looms, the staircases with an open lift shaft were very narrow, the corridors even narrower and damp. In case a fire was started by an incendiary bomb, not a single man would have escaped, and had a person forced his way into the open air, the space between the walls and the barbed wire would have been far too small. The hygienic accommodation was of a highly objectionable primitiveness. On the premises were, for about 2,000 people, 60 WCs, a euphemism, for they were just buckets spreading a terrific stench and no water flushing system." So you can see it's part of the panic of internment meant that the transit camps were very rudimentary. As another internee said of his first impressions of internment, he said he was unbearably cold and had never been so hungry in his life. the transit camps, with sort of the arrest and the transit camps, those tend to be the parts of internment which are remembered with the most trauma because of how they went about. I mean, Worth Mills, it's just near Bury, near Manchester. They've actually recently done a little exhibition to try and remind people sort of what happened in that area, and that was by far the worst. And it made Huyton, which is the camp that was in Liverpool, which was an unfinished housing estate, seem quite luxurious in comparison, because you had unfinished houses, you had some bathrooms. There wasn't actually enough room, again, for the number of people who were interned. So you had people sleeping in tents in the gardens, and it was very much a panic-driven measure, and this meant that the level of planning was quite minimal. But once they got past the transit camp stage, so this could last anything from sort of a few weeks to a few months. It depended on at what stage people were arrested. It depended at what stage people were moved across the country as well. Huyton was very much used as a sort of holding camp before the internees were shipped across to the Isle of Man. And when they were sent to the Isle of Man, they had a variety of different camps. So the majority of the camps on the island were for male internees, but on the south of the island, they had a camp which was for women and children. And these were set up very differently. So for the men, what you had was the government commandeered boarding houses. So again, you're talking about a much better, if you think the First World War internment, it was all tents. And Second World War internment, you're looking at a higher standard of accommodation because they've requisitioned boarding houses, which have still got all of the basics for living. People were in, initially they were two to a room, but sometimes 2 beds, sometimes 1 bed, depended on the house. But they had wash basins, they had control over their own cooking for the first time, which was a very, very big thing, as I'm sure you can imagine. And you had these groups of boarding houses which would be surrounded by barbed wire. So the first camp that was created was Morag up in at the top of the island in Ramsey, and then you had a number in the capital, Douglas, and Onken, Peveril, and then Rushen. The women's camp was set up very differently, because in the men's camps, the buildings had all been requisitioned and surrounded by barbed wire. In the women's camp, the boarding house owners actually remained there, and they just hosted the women like they were guests, and then the barbed wire went up around the town. So if you had a residence permit, you could get in and out of the town, but otherwise you were just stuck within the town. So you do get a lot of quite positive recollections from children who said it was like some giant holiday camp, because they could run free, they could go down to the beach, they could do what they wanted. They couldn't quite understand why their mothers were so distressed, because this seemed quite good. And in true British fashion, you had, first of all, the complaints that the country was being overrun by these enemy aliens, and something had to be done about it. So then they were all locked up and taken to the Isle of Man. And then the next complaint was, well, look at all these foreigners getting a holiday on the Isle of Man. You can't win. So just to give you an idea of this, is just a couple of photographs of some of the camps on the Isle of Man. So as you can see, I mean, well, you can kind of see off the side of the picture on the left, on Morag, so they're actually looking at the sea. They can't reach the sea from where they are because of barbed wire, although later on they start getting supervised swims if they wanted to go swim. I think, yeah, I mean, you'd have to be pretty desperate, but they weren't. I remember talking to the relative of one Italian internee who said because they could get these supervised swims, it was Christmas Day and they were really bored, so they insisted that a guard take them down to swim. And they said it's not because they necessarily wanted to, because it was so cold, but they just gave them an excuse to get out of the camp, because really the biggest problem experienced by the internees was boredom, because they'd been taken away from their families. So there's a lot of trauma regarding the family separation, but on the other hand, they ultimately believed in the British sense of fair play, and they did think they would be released. But then they're also very aware that Britain could be, it was in high danger of invasion, and if they were invaded, then everyone's grouped together on the Isle of Man, there's absolutely no chance of escape. So you've got this sort of mix of emotions happening. And the British government didn't want the camps to be organised as prison camps. So they wanted the internees to have some sort of autonomy and limited amounts of responsibility. So you have a camp commandant who is in charge of the camp, and depending on their views, that sort of informs how the camps are run. So pretty much all of the camp commandants got on really well with their charges, with the exception of Dame Joanna Cruikshank, who ran the women's camp, and she caused a lot of problems until she was replaced by Cyril Cuthbert in 1941, and then the camp ran much more smoothly. So, I mean, this is the notice that the commandant in charge of all of the camps on the Isle of Man put up in English and German when people arrived. He said, "It is my wish that every man who enters internment on this island shall be assured that nothing avoidable will be done that might add to his discomfort or unhappiness. It must be obvious to you all that uniform code of discipline is essential if a community of men are to live together successfully. That code will be mine and will be obeyed. There is, however, a good reason for every order, and there will be no aggression. The officers and troops who are given charge of you are men of understanding. My duty is concerned with your security and discipline, but my interest goes beyond this. With the help of my camp commanders and their staffs, I wish every permissible measure to be taken that can relieve your internment of its irksomeness. This can only be done with your own cooperation, your own goodwill and orderly conduct. There are amongst you men of widely divergent political views and religious beliefs. You will neither find favour nor encounter prejudice from us on this account." Which was generally quite true. They were very accommodating of different beliefs. So you see, once the camps start to be established, you see the provision of rabbis, priests for every different denomination. You see that the internees aren't asked to work on Saturdays. For example, you get Orthodox houses coming up, and in all the camps they give them facilities for actually being able to have the animals slaughtered so that they can have kosher meat. So there is this way of accommodating, and internees were given a certain level of freedom. You had your roll calls, you were allowed to write up to 2 letters a week to your relatives. The problem with the post was that because it was censored and it had to go via Liverpool, even if there was a husband and wife on the island and the wife was in the south of the island and the husband was somewhere else, the post still had to go via Liverpool and then come back. So it could take 3 weeks to travel just a few miles. So there were many, many frustrations, as you can imagine, with the type of bureaucratic machine that we're dealing with. But the internees were just incredibly creative. So if I show you this picture, all of the boarding house windows, they had windows that were painted in this poisonous blue, as it was described, blackout paint. And so the internees took razor blades and scratched out quite incredible artwork, and different houses had different themes. So there are themes from the Talmud on the Orthodox house, and then there were female nudes on another house, and you had the animals on this house. And so it's just quite incredible based on what they had. And they tore up lino. As you can imagine, the boarding house owners were not particularly impressed by this, but they tore up lino and made lino cuts and wood prints. Kurt Schwitters, who was interned, he liked to sculpt but couldn't find anything to sculpt with, so he used to sculpt with porridge, which you can imagine how much his housemates enjoyed that as it started to putrefy. But they held art exhibitions. This is in Hutchinson Camp. As the newspaper of this camp explained, they said, and I quote, "The human being is not content to live and vegetate only. The tendency to produce, to create, and to build up whatever it may be is deeper rooted in our conscience than many of us believe. To keep this spirit even under the most difficult circumstances, not to lose heart under hard conditions, and to secure progress wherever we are, is more than our duty, it is our fate. An exhibition is more than a mere collection of drawings, paintings, sculptures and so forth. It is a sign, a signal and a challenge to everybody here. Go on with your work as well as you can, and if you cannot do anything in your old line, try a new one. So you had these camp universities spring up. There are a large number of academics who had been interned, and so these lectures were set up on virtually any subject that you can think of. A technical school was also created so that people could learn new skills that might help them post-internment. And there's just another example of some art. We've moved on to... sorry. We have a football match at Onken, so very quickly the internees realised that physical exercise was actually quite a good way of venting some of that frustration. And so it didn't take long before they set up a sort of internment camp league, if you will, where they could play football and meet with some of the other internees from other camps. The camps tended to be, each had their own personality. So Hutchinson, you had a large number of intellectuals there, so it became sort of known as the most intellectual camp. And you had Italian camps, you had a big mix. Now, at the beginning of internment, it was possible for Jewish refugees to be interned with pro-Nazis. And this did happen a lot, particularly with if you were interned under the category of A, then you had pretty much all of the strong fascists, all of the strong communists, and some other people as well. And there was one of the first camps was actually a Warner's camp in Seaton, which is actually down the road from where I currently live, and is now a Tesco's and a new housing estate. But you had quite a lot of examples of fighting and some quite serious problems until actually it could be communicated to the camp authorities that they needed to intervene and do some separation. So by the time you get to the Isle of Man, a lot of that separation's already happened, and you tend to find that most of the pro-fascists have been moved across to the west of the island, to Peveril Camp in Peel. It wasn't 100% that, but for the men, mostly it was. For the women, you had a much more mixed bag, and there were examples of, for the first few nights, Jewish refugees and pro-Nazis allocated to share the same bed. So that, again, got worked out pretty quickly, and you started getting houses done. But initially, there was quite a lot to overcome. The other thing to note in terms of what was probably the most controversial aspect of the internment experience was the transport aboard scheme. So the British government was scared that it might not have enough space on the Isle of Man in order to house everyone. And so what they did was they contacted some of the Dominion governments and said, would you consider taking some of our most dangerous enemy aliens? And after some hesitation, Canada and Australia agreed that they would take a set amount, so long as Britain promised to take them back again at the end of the war. So firstly, that sort of started off relatively well in terms of Category A merchant seamen, German prisoners of war were being transported. However, the speed at which the scheme came into effect, and also the lack of good records that they had, meant that it quickly became whichever internees are to hand. So in the case of the Arundora Star, the Italians had just been arrested, and so they hadn't been taken. A particular group hadn't been taken yet to the Isle of Man, and so it was decided it was easier to just put them on the Arundora Star, which tragically, if I hop across there, tragically was torpedoed and sunk. The news of this didn't immediately filter through, and so some more ships were still sent, including the Dunera, which was the only ship that went to Australia. And the survivors of the Arundora Star were actually picked out of the water, taken to Scotland, and then taken back to Liverpool to be put straight back on another boat. So not only was that incredibly thoughtless and traumatic for the people involved, but also the actions of the British Guards, particularly on the Dunera, were atrocious. In fact, this has happened on some of the previous transports, but it was most publicly made known through the dinero, in that the British Guards actually looted the property. They stole pretty much whatever they could from the internees. The internees were shoved onto the lowest decks. There was barbed wire on the top of the ships, and this is why so many people died when the Arundel Star was torpedoed, because it was just impossible for them to actually get to the safety of the upper decks. And the upper decks had been reserved for the German prisoners of war, because the British army felt that they were easier to deal with because they understood discipline better than a bunch of civilians, and this is why actually they got better treatment. And so with the dinero, you also have stories of the fact that guards would, on the time that internees were allowed very limited amount of time up on deck, guards would break bottles and make them walk around barefoot on the deck, and then tell them not to dirty the deck. And eventually this did lead to a change and cancellation of this policy, but there wasn't really any true sort of reprimands, and so the soldiers were not treated quite as they should have been, considering what they did. So you end up with, although many of the internees were on the Isle of Man, you have also distinct groups that were sent to Canada, and a distinct group that were sent to Australia as well. And in the case of Kitchener, there were quite a few who had come from Kitchener camps who were sent on the dinero, who ended up in Australia. And part of this is because when they were trying to fill the ships up, and they didn't have quite enough people, initially they said to some of the married couples, they said, if the man volunteers, then we'll send another ship with the women and children on, which was actually never going to happen at all. They also took the tack of saying, if you are young and you volunteer because you're single, you haven't got any dependents, if you volunteer, we can get you opportunities in Australia. And actually that is how, that's certainly in the case of some of the Kitchener men, that's how some of them ended up in Australia, because it actually sounded like it might be a better opportunity. Of course, once they were abroad, it was much harder in order for them to sort of move on to what they had to do next, because some people had volunteered to go to Canada thinking this is great because I want to go to the USA, and geographically that is obviously a good thing. The unfortunate thing is if you wanted to migrate to the USA, you had to be a free person, and you had to prove that you had paid your passage between the UK and the USA, which obviously the internees hadn't, which meant that they then had to go back to the Isle of Man to then go back to the USA. The same way in Australia, they had to go back, but you had very limited space on transport. So release was quite a complicated issue if you were abroad particularly, unless you enlisted in the Pioneer Corps. So, as Claire was mentioning earlier, some of the Kitchener men actually were in the Pioneer Corps before internment, so managed to avoid internment. But for enemy aliens who hadn't been able to join the Pioneer Corps in time before internment, they were then locked up, and then one of the categories for release. So in classic British fashion, there was a knee-jerk response saying we must intern all of these foreigners, and pretty much as soon as they were being arrested, they said probably should let a lot of them go because they actually be useful to us, and they created some categories for release, and these were very varied. Initially, there wasn't much help if you were a political refugee or if you were a famous artist or intellectual. Essentially, they were looking for doctors, engineers, and people who would fight. So they had the Pioneer Corps, which was a logistical corps, so it was unarmed, and there were many protests saying, we'd quite happily fight, but we'd like to fight, so it would be nice if you gave us arms rather than just got us building all of your roads, and things like that. So there's one internee said about the Pioneer Corps, he said, and I quote, "I've been put into prison and that sort of thing. All my friends might think I'm a criminal or a spy or a traitor or something. I've done nothing at all, so release me. Let me be like any other fellow. Let me volunteer for any regiment. I'm quite willing to join the Royal Scots, the HLI, any regiment you like, just like any other fellow, but just not the Pioneer Corps." Or as another internee said about the irony of the situation, he said, and I quote, "In a matter of minutes, we were transformed from being dangerous or at least doubtful characters into soldiers of His Majesty the King." So there's sort of a lot of issues surrounding that. So some people didn't want to volunteer for the Pioneer Corps, having then said, "I would have done it, but you kind of locked me up and I've been separated from my family. So what exactly do you want me to do?" So eventually, it was quite a long process, but eventually you find that most of them do eventually get released. In the case of Canada and Australia, if they hadn't been transported back to the UK, eventually Canada and Australia did decide that they would allow them to remain within the country. Australia created its own labour corps specifically for the internees, and Canada did something similar. So, as Ronald Stent said, and I quote, "The men who stayed in Canada and Australia probably found it simpler to integrate and become wholly accepted than those who returned and settled in Britain, because it is much easier to do so in new and evolving societies than in old, established and relatively closed ones." So there were some examples of people being quite grateful that they had been sent to Australia in a way that they never would have ended up there, but obviously not for the journey or the time in camp. So, as I'm sure you can imagine, the memory of internment has been sort of quite mixed and quite ambivalent, because there were certain positive aspects in terms of some of the connections that people made in camp, and some of the skills they learnt. Certainly, many people found that they were able to continue their studies in a way that they wouldn't have been able to before. And also there's the gratitude of being protected by Britain, even though what you come across a lot is the idea that even though it was an awful experience and there were you had a lot of depression, understandably, there were a lot of issues within the camp, but ultimately the refugees were just grateful that they were not in Germany. So you do find it's quite sort of ambivalent in terms of how it's remembered. I mean, that's very much a snapshot of internment. Obviously, I have just glossed over an incredible range of things, but I'll just show you this cartoon, which there is I think what really comes through is the fantastic sense of humour and the irony that so many internees catch when they tell their stories of what happened, or the cartoons that they drew at the time, because there's so much frustration expressed in such a humorous way, and really what I've taken from the research that I've been doing in this area for quite a number of years now is just the amazing resilience of these people who've come from terrible persecution. Many of these men who were interned had, as you were saying, like with the Kitchener camps, they had been in concentration camps in Germany, and to then come to England and then be free and then be locked up again, and the fear that you're a spy, and to sort of have that potential sort of tarnishing of character, of not being recognised for what you are, a genuine refugee, and then ultimately coming out the other side of that and leading amazing lives. If you list the different achievements that were done by all of these people, it's quite incredible. So if you do want to learn more, what I did for my PhD, as Claire sort of hinted at, is I did a comparison of what happened in the UK in the Second World War and what happened in the US, and rather than do an exact comparison of nationality to nationality, I looked at the communities at which the majority of the sort of war vitriol was directed at because of fear of invasion. So in the UK, that was the Germans, Austrians and Italians, and in the US, that was primarily the Japanese and Japanese Americans.